questions. Question orale. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Today we found out that the RCMP is inquiring into 2 alleged police stations that answer to the Chinese government in Quebec. So this is something that has been going on for 10 years. $200,000 were given by Beijing to a Trudeau foundation 10 years ago. And Trudeau has known about this for years. He's had a lot of time to look into this. So I would like a date, please. When will there be a register of foreign influence? The Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to foreign interference trying to harass or to monitor Canadians, that is completely unacceptable. The RCMP has stated that it is inquiring actively into those alleged police stations, and it will not hesitate to act again. Everyone should feel safe in this country, and we will take every measure necessary to protect Canadians from unacceptable actions by hostile authoritarian regimes. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
On what date will the Prime Minister bring in a foreign influence registry? This is something that his own top public servant has suggested, something he's discussed with the Australian Prime Minister, an idea that he's known about for years and could have consulted on all of that time. You have to register if you want to lobby on behalf of the food bank, but you don't have to register if you want to manipulate our democracy on behalf of a foreign dictatorship. That is the case after 8 years of this Prime Minister. 8 years is long enough. Enough talk. On what date will we have a foreign influence registry? The date.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I'll take no lessons from a former Minister of Democratic Institutions whose shining achievement was actually making it harder for Canadians to vote in the elections. Over the past 8 years, we have done more than any previous government to ensure that we have mechanisms and tools and ways to prevent counter foreign interference and reassure Canadians that everything is being done. And we will continue to do even more, including a foreign agent registry. We know how important it is to do everything to keep Canadians and our institutions safe.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I asked a second time for the date for a foreign influence registry, and he refuses to answer the question. Another question is that his department prepared a briefing which said there was a large clandestine transfer of funds earmarked for the federal election from the People's Republic of China consulate in Toronto. Will the Prime Minister commit to return any of the funds that the Liberal Party, its local associations, his leadership campaign, or any Liberal nomination contestants received from the PRC? Yes or no?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
We have long known that politicians across political parties, across levels of government and around the world are targeted by foreign interference. This is a fact. Just yesterday, the 2023 annual threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence community spoke of China's, quote, willingness to meddle in select election races that involved perceived anti-China politicians. So this is not a threat that Canada faces alone. We continue to work with our partners around the world. But at the same time, let me be clear that any suggestion that any member on either side of this House is not loyal to their constituents but a foreign government is not only dangerous, it undermines our democracy.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The question was whether the Prime Minister would commit to the Liberal Party, his leadership campaign, or any other branches of his party returning any funds that they received from this large clandestine transfer. This information was in a briefing note that he received from his own department. He's known about this for months. So once again, will the Prime Minister commit to returning any money that his party or his leadership campaign or any other branch of the Liberal Party got from the PRC? Yes or no?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, despite the efforts of the Leader of the Opposition, Canadians know that foreign interference is not and should never be a partisan issue. That's why we'll be appointing an independent expert to identify any gaps in our system. They will make public recommendations, which could include a formal inquiry or some other independent review process, and we will abide by those recommendations. We also have two national security bodies that will undertake independent reviews of foreign interference in our elections, and we're also taking further immediate action to bolster our institutions, better coordinate government efforts to combat foreign interference, and more.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
So he won't commit to giving back any money that his party got from this large clandestine transfer. Instead, he delays, as he's been doing. He's known about this for 7 years, and now he's got these processes that have no time frame. They could go on for years without us getting answers or action. He knowingly allowed this to go ahead in 2 successive elections, and now he's delaying. What's to stop it from happening again in the next election if we don't get answers before that election happens?
Honourable Prime Minister.
It's a bit rich for the former Minister of Democratic Institutions who did nothing to counter foreign interference when he was in charge of our elections. All he did was make it harder for marginalized Canadians to vote in those elections. What we actually did, starting 8 years ago, was bring in a plan to protect democracy, which includes notifying Canadians in the event our ability to have a free and fair election is threatened, by including on a panel of senior public servants informed by national security agencies and reviewed after every election. That's where Canadians can have confidence in our institutions and in our elections. We brought in rapid response mechanisms, digital citizen initiatives, and a CICOP and other institutions.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, there are 2 alleged police stations that are paid by the Chinese government on Quebec's territory, but the Prime Minister wants to be the one to choose who should inquire into that. However, we know that for years now, the Prime Minister has been getting reports from the intelligence services. He has done nothing. He wants to act alone, and he wants to act secretly. Hasn't the Prime Minister disqualified himself by ignorance and negligence? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it is important to be very clear about the different issues. Obviously, we will be finding an independent expert to investigate the issue of foreign interference in our democratic institutions. But when it comes to the police stations throughout the country, and to see some in Montreal is also very concerning, I can tell you that the RCMP and CSIS are already acting on that front. They are going to continue to do their work to protect Canadians, and particularly diaspora Canadians throughout the world, throughout Canada. The member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, in the best of cases, the Prime Minister is always about 4 or 5 moves too late. He will have to move forward. He will have to appoint a rapporteur or whatever he wants to call the expert. But that person must be independent. And it's important to say independent from him. So can't the Prime Minister recognize that he must ask the House of Commons to make that appointment? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I have huge confidence in parliamentarians to do their job of seeing what our institutions are doing. That is why we created NCCOP. That includes members from all parties who get a high enough security clearance to be able to look into everything that our intelligence and public safety agencies do. So parliamentarians are aware of what is going on in our intelligence system, and we do go to the Parliament and not to Conservatives. The member for Rosemont-La Petite Patrie. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the NDP forced the CEOs of the 3 major grocery chains to answer to Canadians. But instead of giving clear answers, the big bosses spouted platitudes to justify lining their pockets at the expense of families. They never committed to transparency. Worse, they now want to adopt a code of conduct to regulate themselves on prices in their stores. Themselves. The fox is in the henhouse, Mr. Speaker. When will the Liberals strengthen the powers of the Competition Bureau to ensure that people are not fleeced by the greed of those billionaires? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we know that Canadians are very concerned about how expensive groceries are, and that is why, for months now, the Minister of Innovation wrote to the Competition Bureau to ensure that all available means are used. We are very happy to see that the committee examined that issue yesterday, and I am very proud of our Liberal team that is continuing to push for the interests of Canadians who are having a hard time paying their grocery bill. We will always have their backs, be it with GST credits, be it with help for rental and dental services, and we're going to help Canadians get through this difficult time.
Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's non-answer is just more proof that this government is working for big grocers and not Canadian families. Because if it wasn't for the New Democrats, this government would never hold grocery CEOs accountable. And these are the grocers who fix the price of bread while Canadians went hungry. Canadians and the NDP don't trust grocers and their CEOs to write their own rules to regulate themselves, but apparently this Liberal government does. So, will this government commit today to strengthen the Competition Bureau and fight back against the food cartels so that Canadians can stop being ripped off by the corporate greed?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we know well that Canadians are concerned about how much they're paying for groceries, which is why months ago the Minister of Innovation wrote to the Competition Bureau to ensure it was using all available tools. It was also good to see committee looking into this issue and calling grocers to account yesterday. Our Liberal team will continue to stand up to ensure better answers, as well as continue to deliver real help for Canadians, whether it's with dental supports and rental supports that Conservatives voted against, whether it's by doubling the GST rebate over 6 months to support Canadians, or continuing to have their backs in different ways. We will be there for Canadians.
The Honourable Member from Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, foreign interference is more an issue of Liberal security than it is national security, because there's a secret committee with secret hearings that report on things that the committee has already told the Prime Minister a number of times and has always kept secret. So it is not with a special rapporteur that we will give Canadians the trust that they need in our democracy. The Prime Minister says that he trusts parliamentarians. Does he trust them enough to let Katie Telford testify in committee this afternoon? I would like to thank my colleague for his question, and I would also like to thank him for participating in the PROC committee. Earlier this morning, I was with my colleague, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, at that committee, and our colleague was there and we answered questions as we must, because that is ministerial responsibility. That is something that the Leader of the Opposition has often described himself.
Tin Halton Hills.
Speaker, in 2019, the Globe reported the PMO pressed the Justice Minister to intervene in SNC-Lavalin's criminal prosecution. The Prime Minister responded by saying, quote, "The allegations in the Globe story this morning are false," end quote. The allegations were later found to be true by the Ethics Commissioner, and the Prime Minister knew it. The Globe has reported that CSIS documents show Beijing uses tactics to provide undeclared cash donations for federal elections and illegally reimburse donors. Does the government believe these reports to be false?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, since taking the reins of government in 2015, this government has put in place the resources, the authorities, the technology with the corresponding transparency that is necessary to shine a light on the way that together we need to combat foreign interference when it comes to our democratic institutions. And we will now take another significant step by appointing an independent expert who will put forward recommendations so that we can take additional steps so that together we can protect our democratic institutions. That is the commitment of this government. I hope all members will join us in this work. Thank you.
Member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, last month on February 23rd, the Prime Minister said in response to the Globe story about how Beijing uses undeclared cash donations and illegally reimburses donors that, quote, there are so many inaccuracies in those leaks, end quote. The next day, he backtracked and said he wasn't referring to the Globe story, but to some comments made 2 months earlier by his national security advisor, Jody Thomas. Why does the Prime Minister give the impression in these responses to these very serious national threats that he is being less than forthcoming and truthful about the facts?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would remind my colleague that, like him and all members, we take foreign interference very seriously, including as it relates to potential foreign interference through funding. That's why this government put into place Bill C-76 to crack down on that threat. In addition to that, we set up 2 independent panels made up of our top public servants who verified that the elections in 2019 and 2021 were free and fair. And now we will continue to work with public servants as well as with the independent expert in the special rapporteur to do this work together. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Leeds Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
Documents reported in the Globe and Mail illustrate how the communist dictatorship in Beijing was operating an interference in campaign in Canada, and it had 2 aims. One was to elect a Liberal government, and the other was to defeat certain Conservative candidates. Now, Canadians deserve answers, and we know that the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, was briefed on this very situation. So will the Prime Minister allow Katie Telford to testify at committee, or will the Liberals continue for a 4th day of their cover-up filibuster?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the supposition that a foreign government's objective is to elect a political party is a ridiculous notion. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that the objective of foreign interference is to destroy our democracy. It is a threat to every single member in this House, and the idea that every single member in this House is not united in repelling that threat is preposterous.
Honorable Député de Charbot-Saint-Charles.
The Honourable Member for Charbot-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister continues to refuse to answer our questions on the foreign interference crisis that is shaking this country. But the RCMP is inquiring actively in the police stations that are governed by Beijing and Ms. Xi Jinping. So will the Prime Minister stop fiddling around with this serious issue and inquire into Beijing's interference in Canada? The Minister for Interparliamentary Affairs. Mr. Speaker, my colleague knows full well that the Prime Minister just answered a series of questions on that very specific question. He also was here yesterday and answered over 40 questions. And you remember there was a bit of a technical problem, a bit of a delay, but the Prime Minister was here to answer the very question my colleague just asked. And Mr. Speaker, with regard to the alleged police stations, he said that the RCMP has ended those in Canada. The member for Charbot-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, all we know about the Prime Minister's answers is that the answers don't tell us anything. All he continues to say is that he will name a special rapporteur, and then he will ask a parliamentary committee that can't speak out to conduct the inquiry. So what are we going to learn from that committee? Nothing at all, Mr. Speaker. But all we want to know is whether the Prime Minister will accept to have an independent inquiry that will be led by someone that will be approved by all parties and the Liberals as well, so that we can look into Beijing's foreign interference in Canada. The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, it is a challenge. Foreign interference is a challenge, and that is why we created the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Public Safety. We did it with the opposition parties. The committee is one that has already made recommendations, some of which, inaudible to the interpreter, I think there was a slight problem with the microphones that weren't working. Could I ask the member? So, yes, we're having a microphone problem. So I would ask the minister to begin his answer again because we didn't hear the whole thing. So, yes, please start again. So, yes, we're going to fix that technology. So I agree. Or I share my colleagues' concerns, and that's why we created the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and National Security, because we wanted to cooperate with the opposition parties, and we will build on all of the concrete measures that we've already taken in that regard. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, there are 2 Chinese police stations in Quebec, over 10 ridings where China might have intervened to influence the election, and reports from CSIS that have been ignored. The Prime Minister has done nothing right in this issue, and yet he wants to act alone, and he wants to act in secret as though he has something to hide. So who will stand up within the government to talk to the Prime Minister to explain that it takes a commissioner that should be appointed for an independent public inquiry? So who among the Liberals will dare to speak to the Prime Minister? The Honourable Member of Public Safety. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With all the respect that my colleague is due, the government is working with the Parliamentary Committee and with NCIRA and the OSSN. The government will work with the special rapporteur, and when that rapporteur makes recommendations, the government will follow those recommendations. There is a lot of cooperation between the government and public agencies that are working independently to protect our democratic institutions. Thank you. The member for Belleuil-Chambly. On a lighter note, Mr. Speaker, but perhaps it's not that light, in Quebec, you know that arts, culture, language, and communication is part of our very soul and defines us as a nation. The Bloc Quebecois has contributed greatly, and the member for Drummond in particular, to set up a lot of the content of C11, and the artistic community appreciates that. But unfortunately, the Conservatives have turned their backs on a unanimous vote in the National Assembly of Quebec. Can the minister promise that Quebec will be listened to when Quebec interests are in play? The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage. I would like to thank the leader of the Bloc Quebecois for his question, as his interest for culture and the work of the member of Drummond and the Bloc and NDP and government members' work should be recognized, of course. But unfortunately, the Conservatives have no interest in culture, be it Quebec culture or Canadian culture. All they want is to protect the web giants, but we will stand up for our cultural sector, for music, for movies, for videos, because our culture defines us. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we are almost there with C11, and really we are in a new digital environment, and the artists of Quebec and Canada must have their place in that universe. And the Quebec government has made its request with regard to C11, with regard to Quebec having some kind of influence on the CRTC's decisions with regard to artist status in Quebec and cultural things. And how will the federal government answer Quebec? The Honourable Minister. I would like to thank the member for his question and his work on Bill C11. It's a very significant bill, and I've had the opportunity to discuss a number of times with my counterpart in Quebec, and it's obvious that the federal government will discuss things with Quebec. We've consulted Quebec throughout the process as well, because it's very important for us and for all Canadians, because this bill strengthens our cultural sector, whether music, movies, television, and everything. And despite the Conservatives and all of the blockage and the lack of respect of the Conservatives, we will move forward with this, Mr. Speaker.
It's another absolutely terrible day for this Liberal government and this Liberal Prime Minister. According to a Global News reporter, the Prime Minister was briefed on a top-secret report that directly connects Beijing diplomats to choosing and funding preferred candidates. Wow. So the reasonable question is this: how many of these Beijing diplomats did they expel? The awkward answer is 0. So we are left with the question, why? It must be really bad, Mr. Speaker. What is this Prime Minister hiding?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Our government has been clear from the start. The Minister of Foreign Affairs has a firm and frank conversation last week in New Delhi with their G20 Chinese counterpart that we will always stand up for our sovereignty, we will always defend our democracy, and we'll always be there to protect Canadian safety. Mr. Speaker, we will never tolerate foreign interference from any country in the world. Thank you.
Member for Dufferin-Caledon.
So this government's response to Beijing diplomats directly influencing and attempting to influence our elections is a stern conversation. What's becoming abundantly clear, Mr. Speaker, is the only thing they'll stand up for is Liberal Party interests. Right. Why wasn't a single diplomat from Beijing expelled after everything's been exposed? What are these guys hiding?
Good question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs has acted, and she's declined a visa to a foreign operative from a country like China. Mr. Speaker, we will always be there with eyes wide open to defend our democracy, to protect our sovereignty, and continue to stand up for Canadian values. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Lethbridge.
So what we see again and again and again and again is that this government will always put the Liberal Party of Canada first. The documents that were leaked by CSIS, the foremost intelligence agency in this country, showed that there was in fact political interference by Beijing and that it benefited the Liberal Party of Canada. In fact, it states that Beijing, wanted the Liberals to win. So, the Prime Minister is skirting around, won't give clear answers. Will he at least allow his Chief of Staff to come and publicly testify at committee so that Canadians can have the truth?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, when Justice O'Connor and Justice Iacobucci issued their reports calling upon the urgent need to have intelligent oversight that was involved with all parliamentarians so that all parliamentarians could see into every corner of government, the Leader of the Opposition did nothing. The Leader of the Opposition was the Minister for Democratic Reform and refused to act on those recommendations. And what we have done every step of the way is make sure that parliamentarians can see into every corner of government. But I would pose the question opposite. The member for St. Albert today said, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, I'll come back.
Member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, more than 1,000 Iranian schoolgirls from dozens of different schools have fallen gravely ill, and it's suspected they are being poisoned with biological warfare. As a mother of a young daughter, this is beyond horrific and horrifying. School-age girls have been instrumental in the women life freedom movement. Iranian lawyers, experts from the United Nations, and children's rights advocates are calling on governments around the world to support an independent investigation of these crimes. So will the government call for an independent investigation?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, ever since the senseless killing of Mahsa Amini at the hands of the Iranian regime, the world has been horrified by the regime's violence, its own people, and their blatant disregard for human rights. We are aware of reports that Iranian schoolgirls are being poisoned, and we are following the situation with great concern. The truth of what happened to these young schoolgirls will come out. We will always stand with the women of Iran. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Mr. Speaker, the majority of care workers are women. They look after our loved ones in long-term care, in hospitals, and in child care centres. Yet these essential workers do not receive the respect they deserve. Many care workers still have precarious immigration status, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. They deserve status now. Will the Liberals finally grant permanent resident status to these migrant workers who are already contributing so much to society?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, you know, the world is in turmoil, and we should be very happy of our government and our efforts in protecting and supporting. My heart goes out, Mr. Speaker, to all the women and girls that are affected by a regime that we need to condemn, and we will continue. And Mr. Speaker, our government will always welcome our most vulnerable individuals.
Bravo.
The Honourable Member for Scarborough Centre.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday was International Women's Day. Women's Day should be celebrated all the time. They have made and will continue to make incredible contributions to our economy and our country. Every woman counts is the theme this year. Let's celebrate all women who fought and continue to fight for their rights, all women that are thriving in everything they do. Can the Minister of International Trade, Export Promotion, Small Business and Economic Development update this House on what our government is doing to support Canadian women and especially women entrepreneurs for them to prosper and have a significant place in our economy?
The Minister for International Trade.
I want to thank the member for Scarborough Centre for all of her hard work. The Women's Entrepreneurship Strategy in Canada is working, Mr. Speaker. Since 2018, our government invested over $7 billion, and guess what? In Canada, women entrepreneurs, women-led businesses are growing. They're 18% now, and up from 16%, under 16%. And our ecosystem is helping Canadian entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs grow. Over 10,000 businesses, new businesses have started by women. Over 12,000 businesses have grown under the support of this government. So I want to thank all the incredible women entrepreneurs across the country for International Women's Day.
The Honourable Member for Bay of Quinte.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal government, this week's housing data shows that the average rent across Canada has doubled. Average monthly mortgage costs have doubled. Variable mortgage holders are close to losing their homes. It's no surprise, after billions of taxpayer dollars spent, records in fact, that housing in this country is worse. It reminds me of the song we listened to growing up by Puff Daddy, more money, more problems. When will this Prime Minister end his more money inflationary policies so that Canadians can finally afford a home?
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
It's really interesting hearing members of that side talk about supports for Canadian renters. We've introduced the Canada Housing Benefit to help tens of thousands of Canadian renters across the country.
I'm going to have to interrupt the Honourable Minister. I'm having a hard time hearing his answer. It's nice to see everyone getting along and talking to each other, but it's getting a little bit loud, and it's making it hard for those who want to hear the response. The Honourable Minister from the top, please, so that we can all hear the response.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is important to note that we've introduced supports for Canadian renters, from the Canada Housing Benefit to the top-up, the $500 top-up that will go to almost 2 million Canadian renters. It is really interesting to hear rhetoric from the other side. Over the years, they've not only voted against our real supports for Canadian renters, they have no plan. They haven't produced any housing plan, any workable ideas. And I would urge the honourable member to take a look at our plan. It's a good plan. You should support it.
Well, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
On est fiers d'avoir voté contre.
We are proud of having voted against Liberal policies that doubled rents and doubled monthly mortgage payments. When the Liberals came to power, you could rent an apartment for $900, and now it's more than doubled to $2,000. At that time, you could pay for your mortgage with $1,400. Now that's more than $3,000. These inflationary deficits are increasing interest rates on mortgages. And the gatekeepers are keeping things that way. When will this government turn around these disastrous policies?
Speaker, what Canadians know is that they can't trust the Leader of the Opposition when it comes to protecting their savings, when it comes to protecting their bottom line. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition thought that to get out of inflation, you could just invest in cryptocurrency. Didn't go so well. You know what else he said, Mr. Speaker? He said that childcare was a slush fund for parents. Whoa. Mr. Speaker, I have traveled across this country, and I have heard from parents from coast to coast to coast about how this is helping them at a time when there's a high cost of groceries, when rents are high, when they need to provide for their families. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, what they've learned is they can't trust the Leader of the Opposition. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Leader of the Opposition.
Well, here's what they know. When I was the minister responsible for housing, you could rent an apartment, an average apartment in the 10 biggest cities, for $950 a month. Now, it's over $2,000 a month. When I was housing minister, it was $1,400 a month for the average mortgage. Now it's $3,200. And 1/5 of mortgage holders at CIBC are actually watching their mortgage grow as Liberal deficits push up interest rates on their monthly payments. They've done nothing to stand up to the gatekeepers that block housing construction. Will they get out of the way so homes can be built and we can bring home home ownership for our youth?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when that member was minister responsible for housing, there were 2.7 million more Canadians in poverty than there are today.
Here, 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 here.
Mr. Speaker, when that member was minister responsible for poverty reduction, there were 450,000 children more in poverty than there are today. And Mr. Speaker, when that minister was the minister responsible for democratic institutions, he made it harder for 150,000 Canadians to vote, Mr. Speaker. What we understand is we're moving forward, we're helping Canadians. He's only held them back. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
When I was Minister for Housing, we didn't have students living in homeless shelters as we do right now. We didn't have 9 in 10 young people saying that they will never afford a home. In fact, you could buy the average home for $450,000, rent the average apartment for $950. It is now double. They've doubled house prices, doubled mortgage payments, and doubled the rent. Their inflationary deficits are driving up interest rates, and they've done nothing to get gatekeepers out of the way and get housing built. Will they reverse these disastrous housing policies so that we can bring home ownership for our youth?
Yes.
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
We know that when the leader of the official opposition was in office, their government withdrew from social housing. They downloaded social housing to provinces and municipalities. We've brought measures to increase housing supply, to support municipalities and regional governments to build more housing. What did they do? They voted against that. And since he's become leader, he has offered no plan for housing. So I would really encourage, with all my sincerity, to have him look at our plan. We actually have a really good housing plan which delivers supports directly to people, directly to municipalities, directly to Indigenous communities, and has re-established...
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Well, and then there was light, Mr. Speaker. After 6 years of lack of action at Roxham Road, finally, there are efforts to renegotiate the Safe Third Country Agreement. So I have a simple question, and yet a simple question that no one has ever answered. What does it mean to renegotiate the Safe Third Country Agreement? What are the concrete requests that have been made of Washington? After all, he wasn't going there to watch a game, a sports match. He was there with concrete requests. What were they? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Immigration. Mr. Speaker, with all due respect for my colleague, I know that the Bloc Quebecois will never become a government, and that's as it should be. But let me clarify one thing in this House. The bilateral negotiations that we are carrying out are private. Our minister went to Washington, met with his counterpart, and we will continue to strengthen the agreement. Thank you. The Honourable Member, what a surprise. We are not asking the minister for the results of the negotiation. We saw at the press conference yesterday that he showed up alone without any U.S. representatives. It was honestly kind of embarrassing. So can we at least know what is being asked for in the negotiations? We know it's about the Safe Third Country Agreement, but clearly they must be negotiating on something. So it's a simple question. What were the requests made in Washington, D.C. this week? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. The U.S. is our closest ally and neighbor. We are working in close collaboration with the Biden administration. And as mentioned, our minister met with his American counterpart in a bilateral meeting. We will continue to defend Canadian interests, and we will not stop there. We will continue to work hard in order to modernize and strengthen the agreement. Thank you.
For Caribou, Prince George.
After 8 long years of this Liberal government, housing rates and the cost of living are skyrocketing for Canadians. The average rate for a studio apartment in my home province of British Columbia is $2,200, and mortgage rates are doubling, all because of this Prime Minister's out-of-control inflationary spending. Families can't afford to eat, heat, or pay their mortgages, and he could care less. It's time for the Prime Minister remove the municipal gatekeeper so projects can get built and stop his out-of-control spending so people can once again afford a roof over their head. Or better yet, Mr. Speaker, why doesn't he get out of the way so we can fix what he broke?
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
I want to assure the Honourable Member that in his own home province, the Government of Canada is delivering direct rental supports to tens of thousands of Canadian renters. In addition to that, we're introducing the Housing Accelerator Fund, a $4 billion program that is meant to partner with municipalities to remove the barriers that prevent more housing supply. Unfortunately, the party opposite not only voted against that, they played procedural games to prevent real supports for renters to go quickly to Canadian renters across the country. They should look at our plan. It's a pretty good plan.
Member for Saskatoon Grasswood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 8 long years, the dream of home ownership is disappearing under this Prime Minister's watch. Home ownership is becoming unattainable for many Canadians across this country today. House prices have doubled. Monthly mortgage costs are bleeding every bank account in this country. After 8 years, because of this reckless government spending, dreams are being shattered. Will the Prime Minister simply get out of the way so Conservatives can fix what he has broken?
The Honourable Minister for Families.
I was in that member's province on Monday to make a great announcement with the Government of Saskatchewan that means that as of April 1st, childcare fees in registered childcare spaces will be reduced to $10 a year. Saskatchewan, the third jurisdiction to reduce childcare fees to $10 a day. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? This helps families right across the country pay for the high cost of everything. Oftentimes, the cost of childcare is the equivalent to a monthly mortgage payment. I heard from so many families in Regina about how important this is for them. We're there to support them, help them make life more affordable, and to give our kids the best possible start in life here.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are continuing to break shameful records. The Prime Minister has gotten us into the worst inflation in 40 years. Canadians now have to choose between clothing and feeding themselves. That's what we're going through after 8 years of this Liberal government. Canadians are having to make heartbreaking choices. When will this Prime Minister admit that he is harming Canadians? The Honourable Minister of Tourism. Well, who in this House really helped Canadians and Quebecers when they needed it? This government did. Not once, not twice, not 3 times. On so many occasions, we reduced taxes for Canadians, but the Conservatives voted against that. When we reduced the taxes for workers, the Conservatives voted against it. When we reduced costs for seniors, the Conservatives did what? They voted against it. We are here for Canadians, and the Conservatives are against them.
Surrey Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Electric vehicles are not just a great way to reduce emissions, but they're cheaper to fill than a tank of gas. And it's creating thousands of jobs right here in Canada. They're also what many Canadians want, and in some parts of this country, the wait list can be over a year. Canadians want to have their vehicles now. How is the government going to ensure that affordable electric vehicles are available for Canadians to purchase right now?
What a great... The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for his question. Zero-emission vehicles are where the rubber hits the road for Canadians who want to reduce emissions and get off the roller coaster of high gasoline prices. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, the third quarter of 2022 saw the highest EV registration on record with almost 9% of sales. Canada is well positioned to be a leader in making the vehicles that the world is looking to drive, but we need to increase production while ensuring that electric vehicles are available for purchase here in Canada, which is why we've set a mandatory target of 20% of vehicle sales to be zero emissions by 2026, 60% by 2030, and 100% by 2035. Thank you.
Well, member for Miramichi Grand Lake.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Prime Minister, rent and housing affordability costs have doubled. Canada's housing affordability is in a crisis, and it hasn't been this bad in 41 years. Average monthly mortgage rates now cost Canadians more than $3,000 per month. In my home province, it's no secret that Greater Moncton has the worst housing crisis currently in the country. When will the Prime Minister stop his liberal inflationary spending, get rid of municipal gatekeepers, and make housing affordable for all Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Sports.
The Conservatives say that they care about Canadians, that they care about what Canadians are suffering due to inflation and an increase in interest rates, but they could really show that empathy by voting for measures to help Canadians. But actually, the Conservatives vote against those measures. When we offered a $500 supplement for Canadians struggling to pay their rent, they voted against that. When we decided to implement a series of measures to help Canadians buy their first home, they voted against it. So instead of just complaining, maybe they should propose solutions that we could apply. Thank you.
At the end, everybody seems to be talking to each other. It's not even heckling, it's just talking. And it's just kind of a rising hum. I'm just going to ask everyone to pay attention to the questions and the answers, and they might be surprised. The Honourable Member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
After 8 years of this Liberal Prime Minister, rent and mortgage payments have more than doubled, and the dream of home ownership for young people is fading. I spoke to a young homeowner from Strathroy who told me that he is skipping meals just to pay his mortgage payment, and that the bank is about to foreclose on his home. And he's not alone. This is happening everywhere thanks to the Liberals' reckless inflationary spending. And Mr. Speaker, why is this Liberal government, will they take responsibility for the reckless housing crisis that they have created, stop their inflationary spending, remove the gatekeepers, or let Conservatives fix this and get out of the way?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, this is pretty rich coming from the Conservatives who got out of the way entirely and thought that housing wasn't a federal responsibility at all. But, Mr. Speaker, this is an opportunity to celebrate something we did today with the government of Alberta. $27 million from us, $27 million from the government of Alberta. Why, Mr. Speaker? 600 new affordable housing units across the province. A good day for Alberta, a good day for Canadians, a good day for affordable housing. Not that the Conservatives have anything to do with that.
The Honourable Member, l'Honourable Député de Bell.
The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-Richmond-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, paying rent has become a headache for Canadians. The monthly cost for a two-bedroom has gone up by 100% in the 10 largest Canadian cities since 2015, and it's this Prime Minister that has created the problem. His inflationary spending is causing this. Young families are having to give up on their dream of becoming homeowners, and others are still living in their parents' basements. When will this Prime Minister finally take responsibility for this crisis? The Honourable Minister of Sports. Mr. Speaker, our government is well aware of the difficulties that Canadians are facing. Over the last 7 months, inflation in Canada has remained stable or gone down. We are in a good economic position in Canada at the moment. We are continuing to help those who need it the most because we know that rents are high. What we don't understand is why each time we want to help people, the Conservatives vote against it.
For Vaughan Woodbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since August 2021, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan have been subject to the rule of this brutal terrorist group. They've had their rights and freedoms stripped away from them. Women and girls have been subjected to misogynistic laws, discrimination, and now even prevented to attend school. Canada has continued to provide humanitarian assistance, immigration services, and aid because that is what Canada does. Can the Minister of Public Safety please update this House on how the government intends to continue to support the people of Afghanistan?
The Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for the question. The relationship between Canada and Afghanistan is deep and abiding, and that is why after Kabul fell, we introduced a program that would resettle 40,000 refugees, a goal that we are approximately 30,000 into, and we'll continue to do that. But we can't forget about the women, the girls, the religious minorities who have been systematically targeted by the Taliban, which is why today we introduced Bill C-41, which will reduce barriers and allow us to deliver the humanitarian aid, the food, the shelter, the clothing that they need. And by doing so, by passing this law, and hopefully with the support of all opposition parties, we'll be able to get that support to them as quickly as possible, while at the same time tackling and pushing back against the Taliban.
The honourable member for North Island, Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, when veterans, advocates and VAC workers come together to say the same thing, the minister must listen. They want the contract of $560 million given to a company owned by Loblaws cancelled because it isn't working. It has been delayed, service providers are still unable to provide services, and veterans and their loved ones are being left behind. Will the minister stop ignoring veterans' concerns and cancel this botched contract?
The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my honourable colleagues concerned about veterans, but this rehab contract provides 14,000 veterans with access to over 9,000 professionals located in 600 areas right across the country. There is absolutely no one falling down between the cracks. What we're doing as a government is make sure we provide for veterans where they need it and when they need it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, at committee yesterday, grocery store giants like Loblaw claimed they pay their fair share of taxes, but we know that's not true. While regular Canadians struggle with the rising cost of living, the wealthiest corporations in the country are busy avoiding $30 billion in corporate taxes as they report much higher book profits, which is what they report to shareholders, than they pay in taxable income after exploiting loopholes. The U.S. already has a minimum tax on these higher book profits. Will the governing party follow suit in Budget 2023?
The Honourable Minister for Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the question from my honourable colleague, and our government has worked since we formed government to close tax loopholes and ensure everyone pays their fair share. We brought in the Canada Recovery Dividend and increased taxes on bank profits and those of insurance companies. We continue to work with OECD partners to make sure there's a minimum tax that is in place. These are concrete steps, and the work continues.
That's all the time we have. C'est tout le temps que nous avons aujourd'hui. I wish to draw the attention of members to the presence in the gallery of the Honourable Brad Johns, Attorney General and Minister of Justice for the province.